we can be with what our life brings us. That doesn't mean we're not going to experience challenge and difficulty and disappointment and grief and anger and all the rest, but that there is something very profound, enduring, inherent that knows how to be with what is.
This episode of the podcast features Diane Musho Hamilton. We learn about her early upbringing in the Mormon Church, her early studies of Buddhism and Naropa Institute, and later her studies in Zen and integral studies with Genpo Roshi and Ken Wilber, leading us to this very moment where she is an author, Zen teacher, and facilitator. Her books on skillful communication are fantastic. My staff has done multiple trainings with her, and she's just one of my favorite people and authors. I can't wait for you to learn more about her. Will you tell me a little bit about where you're from and the household you grew up in? Like, what are some of your earliest memories?
So I grew up in a small town on the outskirts of the West Desert of Utah. So I grew up in a place with big geographic features, big mountains, the Great Salt Lake, the Great Basin, of Western Utah. And I also grew up in a very small town, so I was in the natural world a lot. I rode horses as a kid, walked to school, played sports. So a very physical and natural environment that I grew up in. And the small town I was in was interesting because it was ethnically and racially diverse because there was an army depot there. So a lot of people from Eastern Europe and from Southern Europe, and then people from Latin America and New Mexico had all come to work first in the mines and then in the army depot there. So I grew up in a nicely culturally diverse atmosphere for, basically a town in Utah and in the Western U.S. Yeah.
Not what you think of for that part of the country at that time necessarily.
Yeah, that's right.
Cool.
So it was there was the Northern European white Mormon group, and I was on the edge of that. My father was orphaned when he was 13, so he didn't belong to groups much, so we were kind of on the edge of that. But then, as I said, a lot of people who worked first in the mines and then came in from the outside. So I had kind of a nice cultural diverse upbringing in a way.
Great. And that kind of dovetails into the next question, which is, what was the spiritual or religious setting of your youth, and what was your relationship with it? Was it something that you embraced or resented, or a little bit of both?
Well, my grandparents were both in the Mormon church. They refer to it as the LDS Church now, Latter-day Saints. And so it had a very Northern European, Scandinavian, Protestant, big work ethic, kind of a quality of good works and redemption kind of come together. Lots of people, when I was young, technology, there was industrialization, but there wasn't technology. So people were working with their hands a lot more in the church. There was just really solid community, Christian teaching. And I didn't really know too much other than the stories of Jesus, because I really didn't understand the dogma or the, doctrines of the church. And it was, without being able to name it as a kid, I found it boring and conventional. It was just, everything was already a given, the way you're supposed to think, the way you're supposed to behave, the way you're supposed to act. And so there's a certain way that there's just something polite and important about human beings being decent to each other, which the church was extremely good at. And it was a good community. And I think I just had an adventuresome spirit. I wanted to get out beyond. And my family didn't go to church.
Okay.
We're
It was more
heathens.
just it was in the culture around you, not so much in your house. But what was your parents' relationship to spirituality or religion? Was it something that, obviously they didn't force it upon you, and it sounds like it wasn't a big part of their day-to-day life, but what was their relationship with it?
Well, my grandmother was very devout, and she was genuinely she was a religious woman, but more importantly, she was a spiritual woman. And that was just conveyed through how she was. I mean, she had a lot of presence. She had kind of inherent respect for others. She cared about other human beings. She liked to laugh. I mean, she had a kind of I don't know what you'd call her, some kind of siddha. She had a quality about her that was really joyful. And then and my father kind of had that too without training. My father he just had a lot of good faith and goodwill. He was orphaned when he was 12, and he had lost 2 brothers, then his parents died, then he went to live with his sister, and she died having her tonsils out. So 10, 12, and 13, he lost his primary caretakers. But my dad had a lot of equanimity, and my mother was fierce and brilliant and also had great hearts. So they kind of all had something that I recognized in them, I think, as some kind of spiritual nature. My grandmother was maybe the only one that was doing a religious practice, but I really felt it
Yeah.
from my mother and father as well.
Okay.
And then the
Interesting.
natural world,
Yeah.
you just grow up in the natural world, and waking
Yeah.
up and looking at the stars does it.
Uh-huh.
Yeah. Yeah.
Just to turn away from the more serious questions for a second, what's a
Yeah.
piece of pop culture that stands out from your formative years? And tell me a little bit about it, like why little Diane was so enamored by that particular thing, like a movie, a song, a show, whatever it was.
Well, I mean, I just think it's kind of ridiculous right now, but let's just, as pop culture, let's think about Roy Orbison
Uh-huh.
singing, whatever he sings in that leather jacket with those Ray-Bans. Like, it was like, I just feel like that is the consummate sense of style for an early songbird and rock and roller like Roy Orbison. So he's coming to mind wearing that jacket and those Ray-Bans. That's
What
cool.
do you remember about how old you were when you first encountered him?
I mean, I couldn't have been more than 9 or 10,
Okay.
right? And then, he came back again later,
Yeah. I mean,
yeah,
that's the later wave, I
yeah,
think, was when I experienced him.
yeah,
Yeah, but
yeah. How did you experience him? In what context did you experience him?
was he on the soundtrack for Pretty Woman?
Well,
Did
his
he do that
song, it
song?
is Pretty Woman is
Oh,
him,
okay.
yeah, for sure.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then he has a very awesome concert called Black and
Mm,
White Nights that he does
okay.
with all these major talents like Bruce
Mm,
Springsteen and Elvis Costello and Katie Lang, and they're all like they're all holding him up as a guru,
right.
and he's singing and doing his 4 or 5 octave thing.
Yeah.
Yeah, so check that out if you haven't seen it.
Okay, I will. Yeah.
Yeah,
And
yeah,
all you other people, check that out.
yeah. He's very good. He's got a good Buddhist capacity. I believe Roy Orbison is one of the great transmuters of sorrow into illumination. It's like the way he moves with sorrow in his singing and then liberates it is really great. Yeah.
Okay, I can't remember ever actually listening to his lyrics and following, I was just more stuck on the tonality of it, but
Yeah,
that's a really
he's such a
interesting
beautiful
thing.
singer, yeah,
Mm,
and, so did you ever remember Only the Lonely?
yeah, of course.
Yeah, Only the Lonely, so
Yeah.
taking on Only the Lonely,
Mm,
you gotta be a siddha to do that.
okay. Beautiful. And what's the first book you remember reading that really rocked your world and shifted your perception or perhaps fueled your interest in following a spiritual path?
To be honest, I felt my mind turn towards the spiritual most profoundly when I received the catalog of courses from Naropa Institute.
Cool.
Like, when it arrived in the mail, and it was beautiful, it was purple, and it had a Tibetan seal on the front of it, and I just felt my heart and mind just open in a way that I wanted to receive whatever that was. So, I would say the image and the feeling of something came into me maybe more directly than the content of any book that I read. Now, later, I could say books, we could talk
Sure.
about Rumi, we could talk
Yeah.
about this Zen master,
Okay.
Hongzhi, Chinese.
Yeah. Right.
But my early turning towards the spiritual came more through images and more through feeling, I think.
How did you end up with that Naropa catalog? Did you stumble upon it, or was it sent to you? Did you request it?
I requested it, yeah.
Hmm.
I went to college. I was existentially overwrought. I couldn't solve I had friends die when I was 17, and so when I went to college, my questions were deeply existential, and I had the Mormon training, but it was a faith-based training, and I had a lot of questions in my mind, philosophical questions. But Trungpa Rinpoche framed it the best. How do we respond to the fact of death? How do we respond to the fact of that in our life? And I think that that's what I was grappling with when I went to college because of the loss of these friends. And so I was really kind of wrestling with that question of how do we live given that life is impermanent? And through studying philosophy and literature and kind of leading with my mind, I didn't have much religious training, but the religious training wasn't scratching that itch at all. And for whatever reason, I knew that I just kind of intuitively knew that I needed to move towards something more spiritual. So I applied for a master's degree from Naropa, from the Integral Center for Integral Studies in San Francisco, maybe someplace in New York or whatever. But when the product arrived, it was so impactful to me. And then there was another article that was written by Chogyam Trungpa Rinpoche that said, "Taming the horse, riding the mind." And when I read that headline, I grew up as a horsewoman in Western Utah, and I was like, right. It just spoke to me. So that was when I became a Buddhist. Is right then.
Okay.
You could say.
And was that catalog enough to lure you into that program? Did you end up going to Naropa?
That catalog was enough to lure me into the office of Dr. Antonio Wood.
Oh, tell me about that.
I believe he was a psychiatrist. He taught in the at the time it was the contemplative psychology program at Naropa. I believe he was either Chilean. I think he was Chilean, but he could have been Argentinian. I'm not sure. But he was Latin, and I was still. I had tasted, you know, Buddhist medicine, but I hadn't practiced. So I was still overwrought and somewhat just anxious about being alive and not knowing how to orient in the world. And so I was going to join this program, and there was a retreat part of it where we were up in the mountains for 10 weeks, and I had to do a lot of wrangling to get that to work, and I was anxious about it. And just coming into his presence and into the atmosphere of his home, because he had the meeting with me in his home, he was so simple and elegant and present with, my youthful anxiety. And, I was hooked. Again, it was just, I left that meeting confident that what I was going to experience was going to address what I wanted and needed at that point in my life. His presence was profoundly impactful to me. I didn't really ever get to know him, once I came, because he taught very little at that point. Then I think he ended up going on a long retreat. But it was the meeting with him that really sealed the deal, for sure.
Okay.
Mhm.
And then did you end up attending a
Naropa?
full-length
Mhm.
program at Naropa?
Yeah. I got a master's degree.
Tell me
Yeah.
a little bit about that experience.
Well, first of all, so again, I had studied philosophy and literature, and without knowing it at the time, I can really easily explain it now, is that I was still in the narrative of the mind, and I was still in the dualism of philosophy, and so I had never tasted the place beyond those limits, And the first time that I sat in well, I call zazen, or back then it was shamatha vipassana practice. I somehow, without knowing it, that gap closed for me, and I really became one with my experience. And the permission to just simply be and notice and receive, if you will, exactly what was happening just had a profound impact on me. It was I wouldn't call it an enlightenment experience, but it was something, you know. And so the practice of sitting was always fundamental to the education at Naropa. That was front and center. And then we also were in a psychology program, so we were working with, I would say, what Trungpa Rinpoche would say, a kind of confidence in the sanity of the mind, and really cultivating both a practice and a way of working with our minds and with the minds of others that promoted inherent sanity. And as we were talking about earlier, there's like my grandmother's ability to laugh with all the stresses and challenges she went through. And yet there she was, just joyful and present and like the real thing. And so I feel like I just got that really early training. Trungpa Rinpoche was still alive, and so I was able to be in his company on, I don't know, 4 or 5 occasions where he gave talks or was at an event or something. Um, I didn't know him personally. I didn't exchange with him personally, but I felt like I entered his Dharma realm and I received his teaching energetically from just being in that milieu. Yeah, it was just so essential, my relationship to fear, my relationship to anger, Buddha nature. I don't know the Tibetan words so much. Rigpa, whatever those words
Yeah.
are.
Yeah. Did that time at Naropa dovetail into your introduction into Ken Wilber's world, or were they separated by some years?
Yeah, they were separated. I graduated from Naropa when I was 26, and then I had my son when I was 30, and I became a mediator right around the same time. I had to move to Seattle because my son was born with Down syndrome and couldn't get enough oxygen at altitude. So I moved to the coast. Yeah, I lived there for a year and a half. And while I was there, that's when I got into mediation. And it's taken me 40 years to figure out that meditate and mediate have something in common.
Not just often confused for each other by the difference
Yeah.
in one letter.
Right, which is in all my it's always wrong, Yeah. Yeah, but just this impulse to, realize the inherent unity of all things and that people walk into your office with a dispute, that's pretty intimate. They're in a conflict
Yeah.
together. There's something that they got something going on that's the same. And, same with meditation. It's like you come experiencing yourself in a way as fragmented, but through the practice, you discover, in fact, that you are not separate and that everything's more okay than you think. Yeah, yeah. So then I met Ken when I was 44.
Okay.
So that was like 18 years later.
Did your immersion in the world of Zen happen before that, or after that, or around the same time?
Well, what happened is that I was really receiving and very, with tremendous passion, Trungpa Rinpoche's teaching. And at the end of my time at Naropa is actually when he became ill and died in the spring. So it just wasn't really an option. And then there was a scandal that ensued related to the regent and the person that he had picked as his successor and some of his ethical conduct. And then I moved. So in a way, that kind of spelled the completion of that training. And then there was a number of years where I just practiced on my own and raised my son. And then I got very clear that I wanted deeper practice. And then that's when I met my Zen teacher in Salt Lake City because he had a center in Salt Lake City. So I picked up formal practice again with a lot of passion. And it was in the Zen tradition then at this
Can
time.
you tell me some stories about meeting your Zen teacher? And was it meeting that teacher that drew you into those teachings, or were you looking for the modality of your study and you connected with the Zen teachings, or was it the teacher or the teachings that you connected with at that time?
Well, what happened was I went up to the Zen Center, which was up near the university. Trying to think when this was. So, it's funny, my teacher's always trying to recall dates. And when he used to give talks, and he'd always be, like, using everyone to recall the date, and I would get so annoyed, like, "What does it matter?" And here I am doing exactly what he used to do. So, um, so I think it was around 90 or 91, right, when he opened his center that I went up because I was feeling that appetite for really rigorous training, and I went to meet him, and I listened to a talk, and it was very interesting. 2 things happened. One was that he spoke kind of in the accent of his Japanese teacher. Like, he was so fresh out of his training that my Izumi Roshi, who was his, transmitting teacher, he talked like him, like a Japanese master. And, I walked out with the absolute distinct impression, and maybe you've heard this before because I think it circulates in Buddhist, circles, that this idea that entering the Dharma is like a snake crawling into a bamboo tube. and the only way out is through. And I was so clear that that was the case again, that if I started to practice with Roshi, that I was in it for the long haul. And so I didn't go back for another 3 years.
Because you were afraid of the tube.
Because I knew the tube was waiting for me and I wasn't ready.
Yeah. Okay. Okay.
Yeah, exactly. So then what happened is that I was working at the courts. I was hired as the director of dispute resolution. The Chief Justice had lost his wife. Someone told him that I was a Buddhist. I had a picture of His Holiness in my office. So he came in and started talking to me about meditation and his interest in Buddhist practice and wondering what I was thinking. And I started making a joke and said, there's a guy who's teaching up on the hill, and you guys have a lot in common. There's a lot of black robes, a lot of gongs, and a lot of standing up when you come in the room. So he, and that was just, it was funny. So he went to a beginner's class at the center before I connected again after that 3-year period. It was because he went that I went after that. So the first night he went, his wife had died of cancer about a year earlier. And so he went to the opening class, and he always tells the story about this Polish woman who came in and she just dispensed with all the, kind of American, icebreakers or whatever. And she walks in and she like looks at everyone. In Buddhism, there is no hope. That's how she starts. And my husband said he never felt so much relief in his life. He just was like, oh, thank you. Because he'd been through so much with the loss of his wife and hope and, So he came back the next week and the other college students didn't come back. He was the only one who returned. So it was him. So he led me to go back up there. It was he and I started dating and we went up there, and that's how I met my teacher.
Wow. And I don't think you've named the teacher's name yet.
Genpo Roshi. Dennis Merzel. Dennis Genpo Merzel Roshi.
Okay.
Yeah.
And so then you and your husband kind of started that path together.
Yes, that's right.
Have obviously continued that together because you run the center collectively now, correct?
That's right. That's right.
Okay,
and
wonderful.
we have extremely different styles. And they balance each other. I think our styles, he's extremely steady and very simple, and I'm much more dynamic and some would say chaotic, and that I feel like the energetic impressions and teaching I receive from Trungpa is a big part of my teaching.
So other than that initial meeting with Genpo Roshi, what are some of the things that stand out in your mind when you think about him and his teachings? Do you have, like, when you think about him, is there something that comes up in your mind, like a particular experience or circumstance, or a couple of them?
Well, the first thing for sure. So he was born in New York, grew up in Long Beach. He was a long distance swimmer and a world-class water polo player. So he's a real athlete. And the steadiness of being a long distance swimmer, like his capacity to just sit and he was a profoundly powerful person to sit with, just to sit with him in the Zendo. I would say that's, in terms of his teaching, that was far and away what had the greatest impact, was sitting in the Zendo when he was in the Zendo.
The presence.
And stability of mind, tremendous stability. And I feel that Trungpa Rinpoche opened the Dharma world to me, and Genpo Roshi took me deep in meditation, I would say. And then the other thing I would say is that he was creative. He was an innovator. And so he synthesized the big mind process just to help people become more clear about their insight, and really liked using a dialogic process to help illuminate Zen stories and Zen training, koans. Yeah, his creativity was very, very profound. And I would say the final thing is just the privilege of being able to be close enough to a teacher to really, really receive both the transmissive dimension of them as a teacher, but also the embodiment, that I could really, really get those physical impressions, to go back to when I was a kid, the physical impressions of being in nature, of being on a horse, of being with my teacher. Really important.
I'm also just curious to hear a little bit about your introduction into Ken's world and what you made of that and how that's influenced your path and the way you teach.
So if Trungpa Rinpoche just revealed the Dharma world and Genpo Roshi introduced me to emptiness and to the depths of zazen, then I would say that Ken Wilber gave me permission to evolve and to consider questions and perspectives about spiritual practice that are really pertinent to our time. So I think I learned more of the traditional practice, but I think Ken really gave me permission to start to pose questions that are relevant to how we practice now. And in a certain like activated a certain kind of contemporary quality in my teaching and training.
And what does your time with Ken look like from when you met him to what are some of the things that you did with him, that you studied with him, that you've created together?
Mhm. So I was about I think I was about 44 when I met Ken Wilber. And basically the way that it happened was that I was using the big mind process that my teacher developed to teach neutrality because mediators are always learning about an unbiased mind, but it's being talked about from the third person. And the big mind process taught them neutrality, taught them how to be what genuine neutrality is. It was very, very profound teaching. And a person who was working with Ken Wilber at the time came to a workshop that we did on this, and he loved it so much that he invited Roshi and me to meet Ken. So that's how we came. We kind of came for this dharmic encounter. And then I was, you could say I was his assistant and I was his student. And then I met the group of people that were doing Ken's seminar in his Integral Institute. And the director of all their seminars hired me to teach in their spiritual practice seminar. So I became part of what was called the Integral Life Practice Seminar, and I taught meditation, I taught Big Mind, and then we evolved a bunch of other things to help us work with Ken's ideas and work with his insights. So I would say that my role with Ken was to take what was often not necessarily clear and show it to people in their experience, right?
Uh-huh.
Yeah. So
Yeah. It's funny, as Ken's publisher, I don't have that much experience with his work. I've read little pieces of it, but I know that our most popular book with him ever was meant to be like a 3-page summary for the Penguin Random House reps, that like they didn't get it. They didn't get what he was about. And so my dad asked him to write this summary that turned into A Brief History of Everything, which then turned into our best-selling book with him ever.
I
That
have
was just,
never heard that
yeah.
story.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh, that is awesome.
And of course, Ken doesn't have the ability to do things in 3 pages, so he wrote 300 pages, which for Ken Wilber is a very short book.
That's a short book.
Yeah.
Exactly. Exactly. Well, I mean, his work, when you apply it, is just really, really helpful. So as a
Yeah.
mediator, when I use his work in my mediation work, he just connects the dots in certain ways and really helps. And I know everybody thinks of him as like this massive intellectual framework, which his writing is, but the experience, the psychoactive quality of his
Mhm.
ideas is,
Yeah.
I found them to be extremely helpful.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
It's so funny. I've been able to connect with the way he teaches through the way you present it, which
Yeah. Yeah.
because I've
Yeah.
yeah, anyway,
That's
that's
my
a whole
job.
different, yeah, that's your job, but you do a great job with it.
And we're still very close. He comes to my
Great.
courses and
Oh, wonderful.
we correspond, and yeah,
Uh-huh.
so he's still a big figure in my life. Yeah.
Great. Great.
Yeah.
So turning back to the trivial for a second,
Yeah.
if
Let's do it.
you had for some reason to go to a desert island and you were going to be there for the rest of your life, and you could only bring 3 albums with you to listen to for that time, with the preface that your answer could change every single day for the rest of your life. But right now, what are those 3 albums that you're bringing with you, and a little bit of why?
I would bring, Coltrane's A Love Supreme.
Mm.
I mm, I'm switching genres right now. I mean, again, I'm kind of dating myself a little bit, but I might have to bring some Sam Cooke. And then maybe, let me think for just a minute. I'm not sure, but probably Ray Charles.
Okay. So little bit of soul and a little bit of jazz.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Okay.
And a little bit of hearkening to my youth is what I
Mm.
notice is that,
Yeah.
I'm very moved by, um, you know, American music and the
Yeah.
music of Black Americans
Uh-huh.
particularly. Yeah. Yeah.
And I was thinking about this for myself, and I think as we get older, we cherish the things from our childhood. Like I think the albums that I love the most are the albums that my mom would play when she was
Yeah.
cooking.
Yeah. That's right. That's right. That's exactly right. Yeah.
Yeah, there's something just supremely comforting about
That's
that
really
music.
funny because then that brings in like my father used to play Herb Alpert. Did you ever
Hmm.
know him? I
I
don't know
know the
what.
name, but I don't know his music.
Yeah, he was like I think he was a trumpet player. There was this other trumpeter, Al Hurt, that he used to play my dad. So yeah, it's interesting. Yeah, I can't pick from my own. I should get something
Yeah.
more current. Yeah.
No, that's great.
Okay.
That's great. Yeah, and I've thought about this a lot because I've done this interview and asked people this question, and every time I think about it, my answers change.
Do
So
they change every time?
yeah,
Okay,
pretty much
good.
every time. I
I'll have to
think
keep thinking.
I think Paul Simon Graceland stays on there because there's something about that album that just sticks with me through the years, but the other two keep changing.
Oh, that's an amazing album, isn't it?
Yeah. Yeah, it really
Amazing.
is.
Yeah. Yeah, beautiful.
Uh, okay, so I want to just go back to the student-teacher relationship for a little bit
Yeah, sure.
and talk about the fact that there seems to be a lot of ideas about the student-teacher relationship either
Uh-huh.
being like all
Mhm.
sunshine and rainbows or on the opposite end of the
Mhm.
spectrum, especially these days, like opening the
Mhm.
door of an abusive power dynamic.
Sure.
But it's obviously more nuanced than that. And I
Mhm.
just love to hear some stories about your teachers that color your experience of this
Mhm.
and that relationship and how you think about it.
Mhm. Well, so maybe I'll start first by just some general things that I think about. I mean,
Yeah.
I think the role of the spiritual teacher, as in our context as Buddhist practitioners, the way we think about it it's a phenomenon that comes from the East, and it
Yeah.
has a guru principle in it. If it's from India, and if we think of it more from East Asia, we think more of the master disciple relationship, which has more Chinese, Japanese kind of tones to it, but just this sense that the realization, the the practice is both. If you think about these great illuminaries, one is karmically illumined, one has the teaching. We're talking about spiritual teachers that their main function is the aw- awakening of the enlightened mind, or the waking up to one's own inherent Buddha nature. That's their function, right? And then there's a lot of cultural trappings that come along with that. But, some of their skills are that they can hold a practice, they can lead a practice, they can give instruction, they can, in my case, they can teach koan study, that they have tremendous commitment, that they're able to model something that other people can model on. And so there's a lot in that. Now what happens is the issue of spiritual authority suddenly starts to take on different connotations when it lands in the West, when it mixes with psychology, when it circulates around issues. Our culture right now, there's a lot of postmodern deconstruction of power relationships, and that we're trying to come into we're really trying to call out power abuse. We're trying to sometimes flatten power relationships. We're trying to distribute power differently. And so therefore, the hierarchical relationship in this context has different kinds of challenges. I think as far as both um, the transmissive function of the teacher and the practice function, those don't go away. You can't flatten those at all. But how the student relates to the teacher can be quite different. And I think it's one of the things that Ken has helped me with a lot is he's given me a way to think about it and to see that another element that maybe can be brought in the West is that it isn't a hierarchy forever. I mean, it's sort of in the way you train in Asia is you just completely put yourself in that mentor protege relationship, and when it's done, and there's that's it. You're surrendered, submitted, orient completely, and when you become a master, then you're set out on your own, and that's a really, really different model of training than we have here. So we do much more stage training. People train in order to achieve a kind of proficiency. They want to be measured along the way. They need to be encouraged in a way that isn't necessarily the case in a traditional setting. So there are lots of differences, but I think the question of the student really being clear and getting clear what it is they're there for and why they're submitting, for what purpose, and then what it means to encounter what feels and smells like power abuse, and being able to realize you either have to call that out or leave, whatever that happens to be. Both the teacher and the students we have to be much more awake to what power abuse looks like and the impact and the negative impact that it has.
Mhm.
You've got to be able to still maintain some kind of hierarchy, or what's the point? And, a good coach is a good coach is a good coach, period. And then, what are the ways that we can share power, and what are the ways that we can both challenge ourselves in ways that we misuse power? I mean, that's not limited to teachers. So we can all look into that. So I just think it's such a different context with different kind of developmental challenges in the wings that we just have to inhabit it differently.
Great. Outside of the luminary figures in your life that you've described already, from your grandmother and parents to Genpo Roshi and Ken, is there someone else that's been foundational in your understanding, either a fellow student, a cafe patron, just somebody who you wouldn't expect to have that influence on you that's been instrumental in your way of thinking about things or understanding?
Yeah, I'll say two things to that. One is I think that being part of Ken's integral community was a really, really helpful community experience for me, because people considering together, practicing together, thinking together, refining together in a kind of senius Brian Eno type way, as opposed to the emphasis being on the individual, because we do evolve in community. That's just we just evolve in a relationship. That's what we do. And then I guess the other person I would say is Willie. I mean, my current husband, my first husband was a painter and an artist, and he gave me tremendous creative gifts. My second husband is a professional. Well, he was a jurist, he's a judge, and he's an ethicist, and he's refined my ethical understanding, and in a way, my kind of devotion to high quality communities, you could say. And then my son Willie is the best, because he actually demands that I um, respond to his mind, and the way he formulates things. I remember when he was about 9 years old, I was getting ready to go to work, and he was in the bathtub, and he was just playing with a cup, pouring water in and out of a cup. And I was in a hurry to go to work. And I walked in, and I looked at him, and I said, "All right, Willie, what are your jobs?" And Willie Willie took the cup, and he went like this. He lifted it, and he poured the water, and he said, "Now, now." You know? I was like, "What? Who are you?" I bowed. The monk bowed
Uh,
deeply.
mm,
Yeah. So he kinda wakes me up in that way, where
yeah.
he demands me to get out of my logical sequential
Yeah.
mind. Yeah.
Wonderful. That's so
Yeah.
beautiful.
Isn't it? Yeah, thanks.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's great.
Okay, so this wouldn't be a proper podcast organized by a publisher if I didn't ask you more about books. And I know you're queued up because I saw those books already, but what are 3 books that have been deeply influential on your path? They don't need to be the top 3 of all time, just 3 books that you found helpful in your spiritual development and that you can share with our readers.
Okay, so that's
I
beautiful.
mean, listeners. Sorry, they're listeners, not readers.
So I mean, I love the Sufi poets. And
Mm,
if I hadn't encountered the Buddhist practice path, I would have wished to be born a Sufi, because I just love the cultivation of the human heart, and the aesthetics of Persian culture, for example. So I love that. This one is the silent illumination of Zen Master Hongshif, and he is a he's he's the kind of the father of what in Zen is called silent illumination, and turns into the Soto school. And I was turned on to him by a friend in Chicago, Taigen Dan Layton, who does translation and did this book. So I love this book because it's very, very poetic and very clear. So, the, um, again, just that experience of someone who really knows how to point out the awakened mind here. And then the other one, just because I've been reading it too, and I really like this. This one came out, I think, a couple of years ago. I don't have one of Ken's books here right now. I do over there. But this is Zen Roots. This is a collection of writing by Red Pine that the last 1,000 years, first 1,000 years of Zen. And these are the sutras. So the Diamond Sutra is in here. The Heart Sutra is here. The Vimalakirti Sutra. There's a thing called Faith and Mind, which is a really important Chinese text. Wang Po's Transmission of the Mind. So, I just like to go for the deep stuff.
Yeah. Do Red Pine's translations particularly speak to? I mean, I love the language he uses. I love his translation.
Yeah, me too. Yeah. I mean, I wouldn't know how to compare it,
Yeah. I just know that when I read it, that it's beautiful.
Yeah.
I don't know the quality of it because I don't know the source language, but sometimes, certain translators, the way that they work with words just speaks to you more. And I find that I really like his translations.
I don't know. I just feel like I'm able to be where I want to be when I'm reading him.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
And that feels important.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it seems that hardship is often at the core of codifying people's convictions on the spiritual path. And I'd love to hear if this was your experience, and if so, what hardships led you to deepen your practice, to feel it more, whatever it was, what those lessons were from the various hardships in your life.
Mm-hmm. So I would say for me, the hardship that maybe brought me to the spiritual path was just the heartbreak of growing up in my family, very powerful feeling people, very deeply caring and heartfelt, but like many families, just carrying the karmic imprint of poverty, of war, of alcoholism, just all the challenges that come up in the course of being human, and just not a good set of skills to work with that. Like, it's like they were subject to all of that rather than being able to see it, to make it object, and to find ways to work with it. And so there was just a kind of suffering that just was never answered for in my upbringing. So I think my whole life has been kind of organized around the First Noble Truth. And then my son, when he was born with Down syndrome, I think that that was a very profound experience, because I didn't anticipate it, and yet everything that I had trained in had kind of prepared me for, you know, being willing to be with it as it was, and like notice the grief of the idea and the dream of what I imagined who my child would be, and then having been taught how to be with who he really was, and in the way that being the cure for the problem was all my training was like, oh yeah, this is actually much better than people think, and I often think. And then, I've undergone just kind of a lot of personal challenges. My mother died of long COVID. A nephew of mine who was super close to, and helped him with his addiction, who had a heroin addiction, died from a fentanyl overdose the day after my mother died during
Oh my goodness.
COVID. Yeah, my good friend Terry passed at that time. And lots of other challenges, not to mention what we're going through collectively right now.
Yeah.
I would say the 4 years that Trump was in office before the pandemic, those are big collective challenges, and we're in that again, where we're alienated from or I'm alienated from a bunch of voters, and we don't seem to know how to. We're kind of stuck together and don't know how to talk to each other, and so the war of that is really, really disturbing and painful. And my son developed psychosis during the pandemic, so I had to spend 3 years helping him heal. So those are, it's like a laundry list of,
Yeah.
things,
And then you
Mm,
you spoke to it a little bit with your son, and in that the reality of it and your idea of it, when you didn't go
mhm,
so much into the idea of it and were just
yeah,
immersed in the nowness of it,
mhm,
that you could work with it. With those other things, is there something from your practice and from your teaching and the teachings you've received that helps you
mhm,
work with
mhm.
that suffering,
Yeah,
or
oh,
that
yeah. Mhm,
that turns you back to those teachings?
mhm, yeah. I think that, the confidence in, Trungpa Rinpoche's my first book that Shambhala published is called Everything is Workable.
Mm,
Trungpa says whatever arises in the confused mind is regarded as the path. It's
yeah.
the fearless proclamation of the lion's roar, that quality that we can be with what our life brings us, and that that doesn't mean we're not going to experience challenge and difficulty and disappointment and grief and anger and all the rest, but that there is something very profound, enduring, inherent that knows how to be with what is. When my dad was dying, I just would marvel at the fact that one part of me was just an act of compassion to make his life more comfortable as he was passing, and another part of me was like in a puddle on the floor. And that what were those two? And the way in which the what we call Buddha nature or basic goodness is is by its nature generous, compassionate, expansive. That there is a it's ungraspable. You can't commodify it, you can't sell it, you can't make any money. But man, is it life changing? Yes.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
absolutely, the practice
Okay.
itself. Yeah.
Thank you for sharing that.
Mhm.
So, you are the author of a plethora of books and courses with us,
Mhm.
the latest
Mhm.
of which is called Waking Up and Growing Up. What was the specific inspiration for that? And can you tell me a little bit about how the book came to be and some stories about creating it? I love that you brought a co author into that who's a student of yours and
Mhm.
has become a co
Mhm.
teacher. And just tell me a little
Mhm.
bit about that project and how it came to be.
Well, it's interesting because we were walking with Nico, the president of Shambhala, during the pandemic outside, and Nico was lamenting that the publication of Buddhist books, that the audience for that seemed to be decreasing with Gen X and millennials and possibly Gen Z. And so Gabe and I, who's my student, and he's not yet 40, but he's close. We were walking with Nico, and Nico was expressing this, and he's a millennial from that generation. And he's bicultural. He's half Brazilian. His father's black. His mother's white. His mother's white from Rio. His father's from New York City. And so he's biracial and bicultural. So he's interested in. He has a big perspective, and he's fluid, culturally. And so he was just interested in this reflection that somehow his generation wasn't interested, because for him, it's been a really, really powerful thing to encounter the Buddha Dharma. So we just started talking and decided that he wanted to make the pitch for why his generation should want a traditional practice. But we knew, because his generation is very interested in the skills of relationship and the developmental tasks that are required by good community, good listening skills, ability to give receive feedback, dealing with shadow, dealing with conflict, all those things that, it's a basket of actual skills that the Buddhist tradition doesn't teach. And so Ken refers to the enlightenment training, the enlightenment awakening as waking up, and he refers to these development of skills as growing up. And the pitch of the book is that we really have to do both. One is very timeless when one encounters it, and the other is very time bound. And you have to practice and learn and develop. And but Buddhist insights of no self and no other, and the ego creating suffering and separation, and negative emotional patterning being a source of one of the reasons we have difficulty in relationship. The teachings are so primed to be also mixed with these other skills, in order to really help us deepen and open our heart in a way that's lasting. I was listening to couple of spiritual guys online, not for very long because I was just kind of channel surfing, so to speak. But one spiritual teacher was asking another young spiritual teacher about his criticism of, you could say, the contemporary spiritual scene informed by the practices of the East. And he said, "Oh, they all talk about oneness, but you can't get them in a room together. They don't start fighting." You know? And that's really what I'm talking about, is how do we
Yeah.
enact that perception? And what we used to do at a traditional level or modern level isn't what we're doing now, and we really have to learn how to do it better. You
Mm.
know, if we're not gonna just behave and we wanna be more authentic and we wanna deal with shadow and we wanna work with conflict and not just run away from it, well, then we gotta develop the skills to be able to do that. You know, that doesn't
Mhm.
come magically, you know?
Yeah.
You have to
Yeah.
practice. So, hence waking up, hence growing up.
Yeah. Great. And then what have you been up to since that book? Like, what's occupying your time now? What projects are you working on? What's happening, like, in
Mostly,
the here and now,
yeah. Yeah,
at this
thank
very
you.
moment?
Yeah. Well, I'm curious about you for sure. Wanna know how you've been and what you're up to. Can you put in a nutshell what's preoccupying you right now?
Yeah, I mean, partially this podcast.
Mhm.
It's been really fun developing the ideas for this.
Mm.
I'm a recent children's book author, co-author, and that's been fun. A little book about Tara,
Oh,
and
great.
also just fostering small community. You
Mhm.
know, I my sangha is across the country,
So
and I never really had a close sangha here. I have lots of my parents' community here. And I
that's
developed this little meditation group in my house on Tuesday nights that between 10 and 20 people come to. And it's been a lot of fun. It's
I'm
been
so glad.
delightful. Yeah,
Wow.
developing
Man,
that and
very
working with those
good.
people. Yeah.
Very
So
good.
that.
I love that. Yeah, yeah, wonderful. And is your teacher still alive?
No, my teacher passed away in 2011.
Oh, that long ago.
And
Okay.
but I still study with two of his sons.
Uh-huh.
When they come here, and sometimes I go to the East to visit with them.
Oh, good. All right,
Yeah.
great. So you're maintaining that connection.
Yeah.
Right now I'm working on succession planning, which means
Mhm.
that I gave Dharma transmission to 4 of my students 2 years ago, and right now all my attention is on the organization. We have been working with the 3 different consultants on our governance, on our fundraising, and on our just our professionalizing all of our bookkeeping and accounting and all of that. So I'm just trying to get the whole organization. It's almost like I'm moving from a startup to a real organization that can be handed off. So I'm really
Mm.
taking care of a lot of, very down to earth details. I used to always joke that if you're a judge, that you spend your day interfacing with criminals, and if you're a doctor, you spend your day interfacing with the sick, and if you're a spiritual teacher, you spend all day raising money. So so I'm doing a little of that as well. But there's a
Okay.
kind of a cool thing that just came around, which is apparently there's a a nice documentary on His Holiness the Dalai Lama that's being circulated for people to give showings, and they'll support you and they line you up at the theater, and then they let you charge for it and use it as a way to raise money for your sangha. You might keep your eyes open. I'll send you the
Oh,
link.
that's sweet. Yeah, yeah,
Yeah,
please do.
yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, I'll do that.
Yeah, thank you.
Mhm.
And then I have two more questions for you, and then we can wrap this up. But I'd love to
Sure.
hear about an author that you've read that's recently published. Let's say like the last 5 years, fiction or nonfiction, that you found particularly awesome, or that like really captured you.
Well, I mean, if I'm honest, I just have to say Ken Wilber.
Yeah.
Yeah, his last book, let me go grab it so I can just show your audience. Hold on for a minute. By the author of A Brief History of Everything on the cover.
Mm.
Yeah, Finding Radical Wholeness. And, just the amount of I mean, the map that he creates for our transformation is just amazing, and
Yeah.
I'm forever grateful every time I tune into him, and I just can't get over the profundity and the lucidity of his mind.
Hmm.
Like, it's just he just has a way of kind of locating these really central ideas about what it takes
Yeah.
for us to wake up and evolve, and he's so ultimately positive, he's a bit of a
Hmm.
prophet, honestly,
Yeah.
you
Yeah.
know? So, a prophet can, I would say.
Great.
Yeah.
Okay, so all good things must come to an end, and this is no exception to that. So let's end with just something that you're a little bit obsessed now, whether that's silly, profound, just something that's really capturing you that isn't Ken Wilber. Um,
Yeah. Um, well, I would say that I built a building in southern Utah. It's a Zendo
mm,
in southern Utah, and we have this kind of beautiful outdoor kitchen, and we have a campsite. And I've been obsessed by the gardens there. I've spent
mm,
about the last 3 years just cultivating the grounds and the plants. And people have really apparently it's a very small town in southern Utah, and it's about 200 people in the town in a county of 1,800 square miles and 1,800 people.
wow.
So, yeah, so they don't kinda quite know who we are, but
Uh-huh.
every time someone comes to the property, they're super appreciative of the
Mm.
gardens that we were growing down there in the desert. So, that's been an obsession for sure.
What kind of things are you planting, or is it more like landscaping, working with the earth that's there?
Yeah, yeah, I mean, we have a vegetable garden in it where we
Hmm.
grow a lot of greens and,
Okay.
for our kitchen and whatnot, but it's mainly, local kinds of plants that are beautiful. There's a lot of blooming
Mm,
plants, a lot of sage, a lot of
mm,
so I just love it when I go down there and get to walk around. Just is
yeah.
awesome. Yeah.
Yeah. The joy that you can feel from a garden that you've built, and how shareable that is from with everyone that comes into that space. I
Yeah.
have a lot of the time that I spent with my teacher was working in the garden, so I have a
Oh,
lot of,
oh,
yeah, it was like one of the main practices that we did
is
in
that
the
right?
10 years that I spent with him. Yeah.
Oh, how wonderful.
Yeah.
Well, I heard this saying lately, and I'll see if you like it, Ivan, but the first one, if you want to be in love, if you want to be happy for a year, get a lover. If you wanna be happy for 10 years, get a dog. And if you wanna be happy forever, grow a garden.
I do like that.
I do too.
That's a good quote to end on.
I was thinking I don't know where I heard it, I just heard it somewhere.
It's great. It's sweet.
Alright. Yeah, it's very sweet.
Yeah.
Thank
So
you,
thank you
dear.
so much, Diane. Thank you.
Yeah, I love
It's
connecting
always
with you.
such a pleasure. Yeah.
Yeah.